I had exactly 3 seconds to decide whether to tell the most dangerous man in New York that he was about to be robbed. And in those 3 heartbeats that stretched into eternity, every survival instinct I'd honed since fleeing Sicily screamed at me to keep my mouth shut, to refill the wine glasses with my eyes downcast like the invisible waitress I'd worked so hard to become, to let the $150 million deal happen in the gilded private dining room of Monarch without breathing a word about the forged signatures I'd spotted on those contracts from 12 feet away. But my father's voice echoed in my memory, his calloused hands guiding mine over parchment in our Palermo workshop years ago, teaching me to see what others missed, and the words left my mouth in perfect Sicilian before my brain could stop them, before fear could strangle the truth in my throat, before I could remember that speaking up in the world of men like these was the kind of mistake you didn't survive. "Che la firma è falsa, Don Marchetti," I said, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees as 5 pairs of eyes turned toward me with the weight of executioners' gazes, my hand trembling so violently that the Barolo I'd been pouring splashed against the rim of the crystal glass like drops of blood. "That signature is fake." The silence that followed was the kind that preceded violence, the held breath before the storm. And I watched in horror as my entire carefully constructed life in New York crumbled in the space between heartbeats, because I'd just interrupted the most powerful mafia boss in the city during a business deal that could have bought a small country. And women like me, invisible, powerless, running from ghosts, didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't interrupt men who could make bodies disappear into the East River with a snap of their fingers, didn't survive this kind of audacity. But there was something about the man at the head of the table that had made me reckless, something in the brutal elegance of Don Dante Marchetti that called to the part of me I'd been trying to bury since my father's murder, the part that understood the language of power and deception, the part that recognized a master when she saw one and couldn't bear to watch him be played for a fool. He was devastating in the way ancient statues were devastating, all sharp angles and cold marble perfection, with ice-blue eyes that could freeze your blood or burn straight through to your soul, depending on his mood. And I'd been watching him all evening from my station by the wine cabinet, unable to look away, even though I knew better than to stare at predators. His tailored black suit probably cost more than I'd make in 5 years of serving overpriced pasta to Manhattan's elite. And he wore power like other men wore cologne, an invisible force field that made everyone in the room unconsciously lean toward him or away from him, depending on whether they were prey or ally. And right now, couldn't tell which category I'd just thrown myself into by opening my stupid, traitorous mouth. The men seated around him were Calabrian. I'd recognized their dialect immediately, because my father had taught me to identify regional differences in Italian speech patterns the way jewelers identified cuts of diamonds, and they'd been negotiating for the better part of 2 hours over documents spread across the white tablecloth like a paper minefield. Contracts for what I'd gathered was some kind of shipping and distribution deal that was probably as illegal as it was lucrative. They'd been smooth, these Calabrians, all expensive smiles and smooth assurances, and Don Marchetti had been listening with the kind of focused intensity that made you forget he was the youngest boss to ever control New York's 5 boroughs. Only 34, and already legendary for his intelligence, and his absolute lack of mercy when crossed. But I'd seen the signatures on those contracts when I'd leaned in to refill glasses, my father's training kicking in automatically the way it always did when I saw official documents, and recognition had hit me like a physical blow because I knew that particular forgery style, had studied it in my father's workshop, when I was barely old enough to hold a pen. And these Calabrians were about to sell Don Marchetti a $150 million lie, sealed with expert copies of signatures that belonged to dead men and dissolved corporations. The forgeries were good, exceptional even, the kind of work that would fool 99% of people. But my father had been the 1%, the best in all of Sicily before he'd refused the wrong job, and paid for his conscience with his life. And he'd made sure his only daughter inherited his gift, even if he'd called it a curse with his dying breath. "What did you say?" Don Marchetti's voice was silk over steel, the kind of dangerous quiet that made hardened criminals confess their sins, and I realized with dawning horror that I'd just gambled my life on the hope that he valued truth more than he hated disruption, that his reputation for ruthlessness was matched by his reputation for intelligence, that he wouldn't kill the messenger just for delivering impossible news. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his attention like a physical touch, like standing too close to a furnace or the edge of a cliff, and forced myself to meet those ice-blue eyes even though every cell in my body screamed to run, to apologize, to take it back and disappear into the blessed anonymity of the serving class where I belonged. The signatures on page 7 and page 12 of those contracts are forgeries, Don Marchetti. I repeated in Italian this time instead of Sicilian, my voice somehow steady even though my knees were shaking beneath my black waitress uniform, the professional mask I'd worn for 3 years in this restaurant, suddenly feeling paper-thin and utterly inadequate. The baseline pressure is wrong. The terminal strokes don't match the exemplars, and whoever forged them used a modern ballpoint pen when the dates indicate these should have been signed with fountain pen ink from the 1980s. The Calabrian across from Don Marchetti went completely still, and I watched his hand drift toward his jacket in slow motion, watched the calculation flash across his face as he weighed whether to deny or to act. And I knew in that moment that I'd been right, that my father's ghost had guided my eyes to see the truth, but that being right might not be enough to save me from the consequences of speaking it. The other Calabrians shifted in their seats like wolves preparing to strike, and I felt the walls of the private dining room closing in, felt the trap I'd walked myself into with my inability to keep silent in the face of injustice or stupidity. But Don Marchetti raised one hand in a gesture so small it barely qualified as movement, and every man in the room froze as if he'd pulled their strings, as if his slightest command carried more weight than shouted orders from lesser men. And I understood in that moment why he ruled an empire at an age when most men were still trying to prove themselves. "Marco," he said without taking his eyes off me, speaking to the dark-haired man standing behind him, who I'd assumed was a bodyguard, but now recognized as something more. A consigliere, perhaps. An advisor who'd earned the right to stand at the king's shoulder. "Check the documents." The next 5 minutes were the longest of my life, longer than the night I'd fled Palermo with my mother, while my father's blood was still wet on our kitchen floor, longer than the 2 years I'd spent watching cancer eat my mother alive in a Brooklyn hospice. And I stood there with the wine bottle still clutched in my shaking hands, while Marco examined the contracts with a jeweler's loupe and a portable black light that he produced from somewhere inside his jacket, while the Calabrians sat rigid and sweating despite the air conditioning, while Don Marchetti watched me with an expression I couldn't read, something between curiosity and calculation, and perhaps the faintest hint of amusement at the chaos I'd unleashed. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the rustle of paper and Marco's quiet breathing, and I found myself cataloging escape routes even though I knew it was pointless, even though men like these had exits covered before meetings even started, even though running would only delay the inevitable. "She's right," Marco finally said, his voice carefully neutral, but I heard the undercurrent of shock, heard the implications crashing through his professional composure like a wrecking ball through glass. "The signatures are exceptional forgeries, probably Corleonese style based on the technique, and the dates don't match the ink composition, which means these contracts would have held up in court for maybe 6 months before forensic analysis exposed them as fraudulent." The Calabrian Bauholm Aten, who'd been reaching for his jacket, made his move, but he was too slow. Everyone in the room was too slow except for Don Marchetti, who moved like lightning-made flesh, his hand already on the gun at his hip before the other man's weapon cleared leather. And I watched frozen in horror and fascination as the most powerful crime boss in New York pressed the barrel of a Beretta against his business partner's forehead with the casual ease of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. "I think we're done here, gentlemen," Don Marchetti said in that same silk-over-steel voice, pleasant and absolutely terrifying, and the Calabrians understood that they'd lost more than a $150 million scam, that they'd lost his trust and his mercy, and possibly their lives depending on his mood. "You'll leave now, and you'll be grateful I'm letting you walk out instead of carrying you out. And if I ever see your faces in my city again, I'll assume you're volunteering for a very permanent retirement." They left, scrambling for the door like rats abandoning a sinking ship, and I was alone in the private dining room with Don Marchetti and Marco, and the terrible weight of what I'd just done. The bridge I'd burned by stepping out of the shadows and into the spotlight of the most dangerous man I'd ever met. My father had always warned me that our gift was a curse, that seeing too much and knowing too much would eventually get us killed, and I'd spent 8 years proving him right by running and hiding and pretending to be less than I was. And now I'd thrown away my safety for a man who probably saw me as nothing more than a convenient tool or an inconvenient witness. Don Marchetti holstered his gun with practiced ease and turned those ice-blue eyes on me with their full, devastating focus, and I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the thin fabric of my uniform and everything to do with the way he looked at me like he could see past my carefully constructed masks, straight down to the frightened girl who'd watched her father die for refusing to forge documents that would have destroyed an innocent family. "What's your name?" he asked, and it wasn't really a question. It was a command wrapped in curiosity, and I knew that whatever answer I gave would seal my fate one way or another. "Sophia Romano," I whispered, and watched recognition flicker across his features, because Romano wasn't exactly a common name in our world, because my father's reputation had survived his death, because even a Mafia boss in New York had heard of the master forger from Palermo, who'd chosen honor over survival. "Giuseppe Romano's daughter," he said, and it wasn't a question either. Just a statement of fact that carried implications I didn't want to examine too closely, and I nodded because lying to him seemed both pointless and suicidal. "Well, Sophia Romano, you just saved me from losing $150 million and looking like a fool in front of the 5 families, which means you're either the luckiest woman in New York or the unluckiest, depending on how the next hour goes." He gestured to Marco with that same economical movement that commanded without demanding, and I felt strong hands grip my arms with professional courtesy that somehow made it worse than if they'd been rough, made it clear that I wasn't being hurt, but I also wasn't being given a choice. "Take her to my car," Don Marchetti said, already straightening his cuffs, as if attempted robberies and exposed conspiracies were just another Tuesday evening. His eyes still locked on mine with an intensity that made my breath catch, and my pulse race with something that definitely wasn't just fear. "We're not finished here, Piccola, not by a long shot, and I have so many questions about how a waitress can spot forgeries that fooled my experts and speak Sicilian like she was born in the shadow of Mount Pellegrino." Marco guided me toward the door with gentle but inexorable pressure, and I went because refusing would have been stupid and pointless, and because some reckless part of me that sounded too much like my father wanted to see where this led, wanted to know what happened when you saved a monster from his enemies, wanted to understand the man who held life and death in his elegant hands with such casual grace. The last thing I saw before the door closed was Don Marchetti gathering the forged documents with a thoughtful expression that promised someone was going to pay dearly for attempting to deceive him. And I realized with crystalline clarity that I'd just stepped into a world I'd spent 8 years running from, that whatever happened next would change everything, that the careful invisibility I'd cultivated was shattered beyond repair, and that the most dangerous man in New York now knew my name, my father's name, and exactly how valuable I could be to him if he decided to keep me alive long enough to find out. I'd saved a Mafia boss from financial ruin, and now I was sitting in his penthouse while he decided whether I was an asset or a liability. And in my world, the world I'd tried so desperately to escape but had apparently been dragging behind me like chains all along, liabilities didn't walk out alive. They were disposed of efficiently and completely, erased from existence as if they'd never drawn breath or dared to know too much about the wrong things. The ride to Dante Marchetti's building had been silent and suffocating, Marco's presence beside me in the back seat of the black Mercedes both protective and imprisoning, and I'd watched Manhattan slide past the tinted windows like a city I'd never see again. cataloging landmarks and memorizing streets with the manic energy of someone who knew she might be taking her last tour of the living world. His penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building in Tribeca that probably cost more than most people earned in several lifetimes, all floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering sprawl of the city like a kingdom laid out for its king's pleasure. And the interior was exactly what I'd expected from a man like him. All clean lines and dark leather and carefully curated art that was probably worth more than the GDP of small nations. I stood in the center of his living room with Marco watching me from his position by the door, feeling completely out of place in my cheap waitress uniform with wine stains on the cuff and my sensible shoes that squeaked slightly on the polished marble floor. And I wondered if this was how condemned prisoners felt in those last moments before execution, hyper-aware of every detail, every breath, every second ticking past like a countdown to oblivion. Don Marchetti entered through a side door 15 minutes later, having shed his jacket somewhere along the way. And even in just his white dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to reveal surprisingly muscular forearms, he commanded the space with that same effortless authority that made you forget he was human and not some force of nature given flesh and bone and those devastating ice-blue eyes. He moved to the bar, without acknowledging my presence immediately, poured 2 glasses of what looked like very expensive scotch, with the practiced ease of a man who did this every night. And I watched his hands and tried not to think about how those same hands had pressed a gun to a man's forehead less than an hour ago, with the casual grace of someone reaching for a pen. "Sit," he said, finally turning to face me with both glasses in his hands. And I obeyed because disobeying seemed like the kind of symbolic gesture that would be both pointless and potentially fatal, sinking into the leather armchair he'd indicated with a tilt of his head, while he settled onto the sofa across from me with the easy confidence of a man who'd never doubted his right to take up space in the world. He slid 1 glass across the coffee table toward me, and I took it with trembling fingers that I couldn't quite control, the crystal heavy and cold in my palm, the amber liquid inside worth more than a week's wages at the restaurant that I was definitely getting fired from assuming I survived the night. "Drink," he commanded, and I did, the scotch burning down my throat like liquid fire, and settling in my stomach with a warmth that did nothing to calm the ice-cold terror wrapped around my spine. And I watched him watch me over the rim of his own glass, with an intensity that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope, something to be studied and categorized, and ultimately either preserved or discarded based on his assessment of my worth. Marco had moved to stand behind Don Marchetti's shoulder, a silent sentinel who I realized must have been with him for years based on the way they moved around each other without speaking. That kind of wordless communication that came from shared violence and absolute trust. And I wondered if I was about to be the latest in a long line of problems that Marco had helped his boss dispose of in these elegant rooms. "How does a waitress at Monarch spot forgeries that fooled 3 of my best document analysts?" Don Marchetti began, his voice conversational but underlaid with steel, the kind of tone that suggested he already knew the answer and was just testing whether I'd lie to him. "And how does that same waitress speak Sicilian with a Palermo accent so perfect that for a moment I thought I was sitting in my grandmother's kitchen instead of a Manhattan restaurant? And most importantly, how does Giuseppe Romano's daughter end up serving wine in New York, when the last I heard, the Corleonesi family was still looking for her after her father's very unfortunate death?" The way he said unfortunate made it clear he knew exactly how my father had died. Probably knew the details better than I did, since information was currency in his world, and my father's murder had sent ripples through the underworld that reached all the way across the Atlantic. I took another sip of scotch to buy myself time, to steady the tremor in my voice, to decide how much truth I could afford to tell a man who dealt in secrets and leverage, and who would absolutely use any weakness I showed him if it served his purposes. My father taught me everything he knew about forgery and authentication from the time I was old enough to hold a pen, I said finally, the words coming out steadier than I'd expected, carried on the wings of grief that had never quite faded even after 8 years. He said I had better eyes than he did, that I could see imperfections he had to look for, and he made me study every master forger's technique, every regional style, every historical period, because he believed that knowing how to create lies meant you could always recognize the truth. Don Marchetti leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, and the movement brought him close enough that I could see the faint scar along his jawline that his expensive suits and commanding presence usually made people overlook, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something dark and woodsy that probably cost more per ounce than gold. And why did Giuseppe Romano, the best forger the Corleonese family ever employed, decide to teach his daughter skills that would only paint a target on her back? He asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice now. Not just the calculating assessment of an interrogator, as if my father's choices actually interested him beyond their immediate relevance to his current problem. Because he knew he was going to die, I answered, and the admission cost me something, ripped open old wounds that had never properly healed, and I had to swallow hard against the tears that threatened to spill over because crying in front of predators was the worst kind of weakness. He'd been asked to forge documents that would frame an innocent family for crimes they didn't commit. Documents that would have sent 3 brothers to prison for life, and left, their children orphaned, and he refused because there were lines even he wouldn't cross. Codes even forgers had to live by if they wanted to sleep at night. He knew the Corleonese would kill him for that refusal. Knew they couldn't let anyone think they could be disobeyed without consequences. So he spent his last months teaching me everything, preparing me to survive without him, making me promise I'd take my mother and run as far from Sicily as we could get. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of old grief and older violence, and I watched Don Marchetti process this information with the same focused intensity he'd brought to examining those forged contracts, his mind working through implications and connections that I could almost see forming behind those ice-blue eyes. "But you didn't run far enough," he said quietly, and it wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact that carried a terrible truth. Because here you are in my penthouse, having just exposed yourself to exactly the kind of attention your father died trying to protect you from, and I have to wonder if that was incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, or perhaps a little of both. "I couldn't let them rob you," I said, and the words came out before I could think them through, before I could calculate whether honesty would serve me or condemn me. And I saw something flicker across his features that might have been surprise or might have been something more dangerous, something that looked almost like respect. My father died because he chose honor over survival, because he believed some lines shouldn't be crossed even when crossing them would have kept him alive, and watching those Calabrians deceive you with forgeries that were good, but not perfect. That would have fooled almost anyone, but not someone who'd spent their childhood learning to see what others missed. I just couldn't stay silent and let it happen, couldn't be the kind of person who watches injustice unfold and does nothing because speaking up is dangerous. Don Marchetti studied me for a long moment that stretched into eternity. His gaze so intense I felt it like a physical touch, tracing the contours of my face, mapping the terrain of my soul, weighing whether the woman sitting across from him was worth the complications she represented, or whether disposing of her would be cleaner and safer than the alternatives. "You're either the most naively idealistic person I've ever met," he said finally, his voice carrying notes I couldn't quite interpret, "or you're running some kind of game so sophisticated that I can't see the angles yet, and I haven't decided which possibility concerns me more because both of them represent problems I don't particularly want to deal with right now." Marco cleared his throat from his position behind the sofa, a subtle sound that nevertheless carried weight, and Don Marchetti glanced up at him with one eyebrow raised in silent question, and whatever passed between them in that moment of wordless communication made Marco's expression darken in a way that sent fresh terror flooding through my veins. "The Calabrians put out a contract on her," Marco said, his voice as neutral as if he was discussing the weather instead of my imminent murder. 500,000 to whoever delivers her to them, dead or alive, but preferably alive so they can make an example of what happens to people who cost them $150 million and make them look like fools in front of the 5 families. The room spun slightly, the scotch in my stomach turning to acid. and I gripped the arms of the chair hard enough that my knuckles went white, because the alternative was collapsing into hysterics or vomiting all over Don Marchetti's probably priceless Persian rug. $500,000 was more money than most hitmen saw in a decade, the kind of bounty that would bring every killer and desperate criminal in the city hunting for me, and I'd lasted maybe 2 hours after exposing myself before becoming one of the most wanted people in New York's underworld, which had to be some kind of record for spectacularly bad decision-making, even by my admittedly questionable standards. So here's the situation. Sophia Romano, Don Marchetti said, and his use of my full name felt intimate somehow, acclaiming that I didn't have the luxury of protesting. You saved me from a very expensive mistake, and more importantly, you saved me from looking weak in front of the other families, which is the kind of gift that demands reciprocity according to the old codes that apparently your father taught you to value. But you've also become a liability, a target with a price on your head that will bring violence to anyone who shelters you. And I have to decide whether the value you represent is worth the complications you bring with you, whether your skills justify the resources it will take to keep you alive against an entire syndicate that wants you dead. He stood then, unfolding from the sofa with that same predatory grace, and walked to the windows overlooking the city. His silhouette dark against the glittering lights of Manhattan spread out below him, like offerings at an altar. And I waited for his verdict with my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. I'm going to make you an offer, he continued without turning around, his reflection in the glass showing an expression I couldn't read. Something between calculation and something that might have been concern if men like him were capable of such pedestrian emotions. Work for me. Use those skills your father died giving you to authenticate documents and art and contracts for my organization. Help me avoid the kind of expensive mistakes that the Calabrians almost trapped me in tonight. And in exchange, I'll protect you from every family in the underworld. I'll make it known that you're under my personal protection, and that anyone who touches you will answer to me personally in ways they won't survive. I opened my mouth to respond, to ask what would happen if I refused this offer that wasn't really an offer at all, but a choice between servitude and death. But he turned from the window and pinned me with those ice-blue eyes that saw too much and forgave too little, and the words died in my throat. Or, he said quietly, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, almost sympathetic, and somehow that was more terrifying than if he'd threatened me outright. You can refuse, and I'll give you a head start before I tell the Calabrians that you're no longer my concern, and you can run the way you ran from Sicily, the way you've been running your whole life. And maybe you'll survive long enough to make it out of the city before someone collects that bounty, though I wouldn't bet on it if I were you. The choice he was offering wasn't really a choice at all, was just two different flavors of captivity. Two paths that both led to me becoming exactly what I'd sworn never to be after watching my father's blood pool on our kitchen floor, becoming part of the machine that fed on violence and secrets and human lives, becoming complicit in the same system that had destroyed my family. But looking at Don Marchetti standing there in his penthouse kingdom, with the city laid out at his feet, watching the way the light caught the sharp planes of his face, and turned him into something between angel and demon, I realized that I'd already made my choice the moment I opened my mouth in that restaurant, the moment I'd chosen truth over silence, honor over survival, and now I was just catching up to the consequences of that decision. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, and I watched him understand immediately what I was asking. Watched him recognize that I was negotiating even from a position of absolute weakness, because my father had taught me that surrender didn't mean you had to stop fighting. It just meant you had to choose your battles carefully. How long would I have to work for you? How long would I be bound to this arrangement? Because I won't spend the rest of my life as someone's asset or someone's prisoner. I won't let my father's death mean nothing by becoming exactly what he died trying to save me from. Something that might have been approval flickered across Don Marchetti's features. A slight upturn of his lips that wasn't quite a smile but suggested he appreciated my attempt at maintaining some illusion of control, some scrap of dignity in a situation where I had none. 6 months, he said. and I could tell from Marco's barely perceptible flinch that this was more generous than either of them had expected him to be. That whatever calculation he was running in that brilliant, ruthless mind had led him to offer terms that gave me an end date, a light at the end of the tunnel, even if that tunnel led through darkness I couldn't begin to imagine. 6 months of your expertise, your complete loyalty, your absolute discretion, and at the end of that time, if you want to walk away, I'll set you up anywhere in the world beyond the Calabrians' reach, give you enough money to start over properly, and make sure everyone knows that your debt to me is paid in full. I wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that a man who ruled through violence and fear would keep his word to someone as insignificant as me. But my father had taught me that trust was the most dangerous currency in the underworld, that promises were only as good as the power backing them up, and that people like Don Marchetti didn't become kings by being merciful or keeping agreements that no longer served their interests. But I also knew that I didn't have any better options, that refusing him meant death, and accepting him meant at least the chance of survival, and maybe my father's ghost would forgive me for choosing life over principles when those principles would have gotten me killed before morning. I agree, I said, and watched Don Marchetti's expression shift into something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been triumph, and I wondered which one terrified me more. Wondered if I'd just sold my soul, or saved my life, or perhaps accomplished both simultaneously. 6 months, and then I'm free, and you make sure the Calabrians and everyone else knows that I'm no longer your concern, that I paid whatever debt my interference created tonight, and I can disappear into a normal life where the most dangerous thing I encounter is an angry customer complaining about overcooked pasta. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, closing the distance between us before I could react, and extended his hand like we were sealing a business deal instead of an arrangement that would probably reshape my entire existence in ways I couldn't predict. I took it, feeling the strength in his grip, the calluses that spoke of violence committed firsthand rather than delegated to subordinates, and the jolt of electricity that ran up my arm at the contact was probably just fear and adrenaline and exhaustion, but felt disturbingly like something more dangerous. Something that suggested my problems with Dante Marchetti might extend beyond the purely professional arrangement we'd just agreed to. "Welcome to my organization, Sophia Romano," he said, and released my hand only to gesture toward Marco with that same economical movement that carried absolute authority. "Marco will show you to your room and get you anything you need, and tomorrow we'll begin figuring out exactly how much damage the Calabrians have done to my operations and how many other forgeries I need to worry about. But tonight you should rest because you've had what I imagine has been an extremely long and stressful evening." I started to turn toward Marco, started to follow him toward whatever room Don Marchetti had designated for his newest acquisition. But Dante's voice stopped me before I'd taken 2 steps, the words hitting me like a physical blow and rooting me to the spot with their implications. "Oh, and Sophia," he said, his tone casual but underlaid with something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, something that suggested the other shoe was about to drop, and I wasn't going to like where it landed. "You should know that you'll be living here now, in this penthouse, under my roof, where I can ensure your safety and keep an eye on my investment. Because the Calabrians aren't the only ones who'll be looking for you once word gets out that you're under my protection, and I don't leave valuable assets unguarded where my enemies can reach them." The words hung in the air between us like a prison sentence, like chains settling around my ankles, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I'd traded one cage for another, that saving Don Marchetti's money had cost me the last scraps of my freedom, and that for the next 6 months I would be living in his home, under his rules, watched and guarded and controlled by a man who saw me as nothing more than a useful tool he'd acquired through circumstances that were probably less fortunate than he'd made them sound. But what terrified me more than the loss of my independence, more than the knowledge that I'd be sleeping under the same roof as the most dangerous man in New York, was the small traitorous part of my heart that whispered this might not be the worst thing that had ever happened to me, that suggested spending time in Dante Marchetti's orbit might be less like captivity and more like falling into gravity you couldn't escape but perhaps didn't entirely want to. 3 weeks working for Dante Marchetti, and I'd authenticated stolen Caravaggios worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, exposed money laundering schemes that had been running successfully for years before my father's training, allowed me to spot the inconsistencies that everyone else had missed, and committed at least 17 felonies before breakfast most mornings, all while living in a penthouse that felt less like protection and more like a gilded cage where the bars were made of expensive art, and the lock was a man whose presence seemed to fill every room even when he wasn't physically in it. I was also dangerously close to forgetting why falling for a monster was a terrible idea, why letting myself notice the way Dante's rare smiles transformed his face from marble coldness into something devastatingly human, why paying attention to the moments when his carefully controlled mask slipped and I caught glimpses of the man beneath the reputation, was the kind of mistake that would destroy whatever was left of my father's daughter and turn me into something I'd sworn never to become. The proximity was killing me slowly, burning through my defenses like acid through silk, because living under Dante's roof meant witnessing all the contradictions that made up the man who ruled New York's underworld with an iron fist wrapped in expensive Italian leather. I'd seen him execute a traitor in his own organization with cold efficiency, putting a bullet between the man's eyes without a flicker of hesitation or remorse, and then watched him spend an hour on the phone with his elderly grandmother in Sicily, his voice soft and patient as he listened to her complain about her neighbors and promised to visit soon, the Sicilian rolling off his tongue with an affection that made my chest ache with memories of my own family's kitchen table conversations. I'd watched him negotiate deals worth hundreds of millions with the ruthless precision of a grandmaster playing chess, manipulating variables and pressuring weaknesses until his opponents folded without even realizing they'd lost, and then caught him late at night, standing at those floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the city with an expression of such profound loneliness that I'd had to turn away before he noticed me watching, before he saw that I understood what it cost to be the king of a kingdom built on violence and fear. My days had fallen into a routine that felt surreal in its domesticity, despite the criminal underpinnings, waking in the guest room that was larger than my entire previous apartment and decorated with the kind of understated luxury that screamed old money and careful taste, spending my mornings in Dante's private office examining documents and artworks and contracts while he worked at his desk across from me, the silence between us comfortable in a way that probably should have worried me more than it did. Marco had become something like a friend, or at least an ally who didn't actively want me dead, and he'd taken it upon himself to teach me the structure of Dante's organization, the delicate balance of power between the 5 families, the codes and protocols that governed the underworld like an invisible constitution that everyone followed because the alternative was chaos and war. I'd proven my worth a dozen times over, saving Dante's organization millions by spotting frauds and forgeries that would have cost him not just money, but reputation. And I'd watched his initial wariness of me shift into something that looked almost like trust, though I knew better than to mistake professional respect for actual faith in someone he'd basically blackmailed into service. But it was the nights that were destroying my carefully maintained emotional distance, the evenings when the business of crime was temporarily set aside, and I found myself sharing late dinners with Dante in his kitchen, just the 2 of us because he'd dismissed the staff with that casual wave that meant he wanted privacy, and we'd talk about everything except the darkness that surrounded us. He'd asked about my childhood in Palermo, and I'd found myself telling him stories about my father's workshop, about learning to mix inks and age paper and replicate the subtle imperfections that made forgeries believable, about the pride in Giuseppe Romano's eyes when I'd successfully copied my first Michelangelo sketch at age 12, and Dante had listened with an intensity that made me feel like every word mattered, like my memories were treasures he was cataloging for safekeeping. I'd asked about his path to power, expecting walls and deflection, but he'd surprised me by sharing pieces of his history, the way he'd inherited his father's struggling organization at 23 and transformed it into an empire through intelligence and ruthlessness and a willingness to adapt to changing times, the way he'd consolidated power by being smarter and more brutal than everyone who'd underestimated him because of his age. The tension between us had been building like a storm gathering strength, growing more dangerous with every shared glance, every accidental touch, every moment when our eyes met across the office and held just a beat too long to be purely professional. And I knew he felt it too, from the way his jaw would tighten when I walked into a room, from the way his hands would curl into fists when other men in his organization looked at me with too much interest, from the way he'd started finding excuses to keep me working late when everyone else had gone home. It was madness, this attraction to a man who'd essentially imprisoned me with kindness, who could order my death with the same ease he ordered dinner, who represented everything my father had died, trying to protect me from. But my body and my traitorous heart didn't seem to care about logic or survival instincts, or the fundamental impossibility of any kind of real connection between a mafia boss and the daughter of a murdered forger. Tonight was different, though, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle with anticipation and dread in equal measure, because Dante had informed me this morning that I'd be accompanying him to an underground art auction where a rival family was selling what they claimed was a lost Caravaggio worth $80 million. And my job was to determine its authenticity while pretending to be his mistress so we could get close enough to examine it properly. The thought of playing Dante's lover, of letting him touch me in public with the proprietary ease that the role demanded, of blurring the lines between performance and reality, when those lines were already dangerously thin, made something hot and terrified coil in my stomach, made me question whether I could maintain my emotional distance when pretending not to have distance at all. Marco had brought me a dress for the occasion, black and devastatingly elegant, and cut in ways that would make it clear I belonged to Dante in the eyes of everyone watching. And I'd spent an hour getting ready in my room, applying makeup with shaking hands, trying on and discarding 3 different pairs of shoes before settling on heels that made my legs look endless and made me feel like I was wearing stilts. When I'd finally emerged and found Dante waiting in the living room, already dressed in a tuxedo that should have been illegal for how well it displayed his athletic build, the way his eyes had darkened as they traveled over me from head to toe had made my breath catch and my pulse race, had made me wonder if the danger tonight would come from the auction or from the man whose arm I'd be clinging to all evening. The auction was being held in a converted warehouse in Red Hook, the kind of place that looked abandoned from the outside, but inside had been transformed into something between an art gallery and a cathedral, with dramatic lighting and hushed voices and security that made it clear this wasn't the kind of event where you could just walk in off the street. Dante had kept his hand on the small of my back as we entered, the touch burning through the thin fabric of my dress, a brand that announced my status to everyone present, and I'd felt dozens of eyes tracking our progress through the room, assessing, judging, trying to figure out who I was and what I meant to the city's most powerful crime boss. We'd played our parts perfectly, I thought, his arm around my waist pulling me close enough that I could feel the heat of his body, could smell his cologne and the underlying scent that was just him, clean and masculine and intoxicating in ways that had nothing to do with expensive fragrances. He'd introduced me to various players in New York's underworld with casual possessiveness, calling me cara mia and tesoro, like the endearments cost him nothing, and I'd smiled and stayed quiet and let my body language say everything that needed saying about who I belonged to, even though the performance was carving pieces out of my heart every time he touched me like he meant it. The Caravaggio had been displayed in a private viewing room, guarded by men with guns that they weren't bothering to hide, and Dante had negotiated our way inside with the combination of charm and barely veiled threat that seemed to be his natural mode of communication with other criminals. The painting was extraordinary, a dramatic scene of martyrdom rendered in Caravaggio's signature style, with that incredible use of light and shadow that made the figures seem to glow against the darkness. And I'd felt my breath catch not just at its beauty, but at the terrible knowledge that settled in my bones as I examined it from every angle Dante's embrace would allow. "We need to get closer," I'd whispered against his neck. playing my role but also desperate to see the brushwork up close, to examine the craquelure and the canvas weave and all the tiny details that would tell me whether this masterpiece was genuine or an elaborate fraud. And Dante had tightened his hold on my waist and maneuvered us until I was close enough to see what I needed to see. Close enough that when I gasped softly as recognition hit me, it could have been from his proximity rather than from what I'd discovered about the painting. "It's real," I breathed, turning in his arms so I could look up at his face, so I could see his reaction, and I watched his eyes sharpen with the kind of focus that meant he was already calculating implications and opportunities. "It's genuine Caravaggio, probably from around 1605 based on the style and technique, worth every penny they're asking, and probably more at a legitimate auction. But Dante, it's also stolen from the Vatican's private collection, which means authenticating it publicly would make you complicit in one of the biggest art thefts in history and put you on the wrong side of not just law enforcement, but the Catholic Church, which even you probably don't want to anger." I'd watched the wheels turning behind those ice-blue eyes, watched him process the information and adjust his strategy in real time, and I knew in that moment that he was going to ask me to lie for him, to call the painting fake and save him from a political nightmare that would cost him more than money. But before he could speak, before he could make it a command or a request or whatever form his manipulation was going to take, I'd made the decision myself, stepping out of his embrace and turning to face the rival family's representative with the expression of professional disappointment that I'd practiced in mirrors when I was 16 and learning to deceive from my father. "I'm sorry to inform you that this painting is an extremely skilled forgery," I'd said clearly, loudly enough that everyone in the room could hear, watching the color drain from the seller's face as $80 million evaporated with my words. Probably created within the last 20 years by someone with exceptional technical ability. But the pigment analysis would show modern compounds, and the canvas is too uniform to be 17th century, which means you're either trying to defraud Don Marchetti or you've been defrauded yourselves by whoever sold you this piece. The aftermath had been chaos, accusations and denials and threats flying while Dante had pulled me from the room with barely controlled urgency. His hand wrapped around my wrist hard enough to leave marks, and we'd been in his car speeding back toward Tribeca before I'd had time to process what I'd done. How I'd just lied to protect him from consequences he hadn't even asked me to shield him from. The silence in the car had been suffocating, Dante staring out the window with an expression I couldn't read, and I'd waited for anger or questions or some acknowledgement of what had just happened. But he'd said nothing until we were back in the penthouse with the door closed and the city spread out below us like a glittering reminder of the kingdom I'd just helped him protect. "You lied for me," he'd said finally, turning from the windows to face me with an intensity that made me take a step backward on instinct. Made me remember that this was a predator I'd just done a favor for, and predators were most dangerous when they thought you wanted something from them. "You called a genuine Caravaggio a fake to save me from a political nightmare I was walking into blind, and you did it without hesitation, without me asking, without negotiating for something in return. And I need to understand why, because people don't protect me without expecting payment, and you just cost yourself credibility with every family that was in that room tonight." I'd swallowed hard, my back against the wall, literally and metaphorically, trying to find words that wouldn't reveal too much, wouldn't expose the truth that was growing inside me like a cancer or a blessing, the truth that I was starting to care about Dante Marchetti in ways that had nothing to do with survival or obligation, and everything to do with the man I'd glimpsed beneath the monster. "You would have bought it," I'd said instead of any of the dangerous truths crowding my throat, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. "You would have paid $80 million for a painting that would have destroyed you politically when the Vatican realized their Caravaggio was hanging in a crime boss's penthouse. And I couldn't let that happen. Couldn't watch you walk into a trap when I had the knowledge to save you from it, even if saving you meant lying, and even if lying meant those families will never fully trust my authentication again." He'd crossed the room in 3 strides, eliminating the distance between us before I could retreat further, and suddenly he was there, invading my space, his hands coming up to bracket my head against the wall, caging me in without actually touching me. And the heat of his body, and the intensity of his gaze, and the barely leashed violence in every line of him made my knees weak and my heart race with something that definitely wasn't entirely fear. "You protected me," he'd repeated, his voice dropping to something rough and raw that I'd never heard from him before. Something that sounded almost vulnerable if men like him were capable of vulnerability. "You chose my safety over your professional reputation, over your credibility, over the very skills that make you valuable to me. And you did it in the space of a heartbeat without overthinking or negotiating. And I need you to understand what that means in my world. How people will interpret that kind of loyalty. How I am interpreting it right now." "How are you interpreting it?" I'd whispered, the words barely audible over the thundering of my pulse. And I'd watched something shift in his expression, watched the careful control he always maintained start to crack around the edges, watched him lean closer until his breath was warm against my lips, and every cell in my body was screaming at me to close the distance, to take what I wanted even though wanting it was the most dangerous thing I'd ever done. "Like you're mine," he'd said, and then his mouth was on mine, claiming and possessing and destroying every defense I'd tried to maintain over 3 weeks of proximity and tension. And I was kissing him back with a desperation that should have terrified me, my hands fisting in his jacket, pulling him closer even though closer was dangerous, even though this was exactly the kind of mistake that would change everything and make the next 6 months infinitely more complicated than they already were. He kissed like he did everything else, with total focus and devastating skill, and an intensity that made me forget my own name, made me forget why this was wrong, made me forget everything except the taste of him and the feel of his hands sliding down to my waist and the way he groaned against my mouth like I was water and he was dying of thirst. When he finally pulled back, we were both breathing hard, and I could see my own shock reflected in his eyes, the recognition that we'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that had transformed the careful professional arrangement between us into something infinitely more dangerous and complicated. "You shouldn't have protected me tonight, Sophia," he'd said, his voice rough and his hands still on my waist like he couldn't quite make himself let go, like gravity was working differently between our bodies than it did for the rest of the world. "Now I can't let you go. Can't pretend this is just business or temporary or something I can walk away from when your 6 months are up. And I don't know if I'm angry about that or relieved. Don't know if you just saved me or damned us both." He'd stepped back then, creating physical distance even though the emotional damage was already done, even though the taste of him was still on my lips, and the feel of him was branded into my skin. And he'd walked away toward his bedroom without another word, leaving me collapsed against the wall, trying to remember how to breathe, trying to understand what had just happened and what it meant for the careful balance I'd been trying to maintain. I'd stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my fingers touching my lips like I could still feel the pressure of his mouth on mine, my mind racing through implications and consequences, and the terrible knowledge that I was falling for Dante Marchetti despite every logical reason not to. Falling for a man who could never be anything but dangerous, who represented everything I should hate, who I'd just protected without thinking, because somewhere in the last 3 weeks, he'd stopped being my captor and started being something else entirely. Something I didn't have words for and didn't dare examine too closely. I'd finally pushed away from the wall and walked toward my room on shaking legs, my body still humming with the aftershocks of that kiss, my mind trying to process the magnitude of what had shifted between us tonight. But I'd only made it halfway down the hall when I'd heard Dante's door open behind me and turned to find him standing there, still fully dressed, looking tortured and desperate, and more human than I'd ever seen him. "You shouldn't have protected me tonight, Sophia," he'd repeated, and this time there was something broken in his voice, something that sounded like a confession or a warning or maybe both. "But now that you have, now that you've shown me what it feels like to have someone choose my safety over their own interests, I'm not strong enough to be noble about it, not honorable enough to maintain appropriate distance, and I need you to understand that before this goes any further, before we make this mistake that we're both clearly desperate to make, despite how catastrophically it could end. I'd wanted to tell him that it was already too late, that the mistake had been made the moment I'd opened my mouth in that restaurant 3 weeks ago, that falling for him had been inevitable from the second his eyes had met mine with something more than cold calculation. But before I could find the words, before I could take the step toward him or away from him that would seal our fate one way or another, his phone had started ringing with the harsh insistence that meant emergency, that meant crisis, that meant the real world was intruding on this moment with all its demands and dangers and impossibilities. He'd answered it with visible reluctance, his eyes never leaving mine, and I'd watched his expression shift from tortured vulnerability back to cold command in the space of a heartbeat. Watched the boss reassert control over the man, watched the mask slide back into place even though I'd seen beneath it now and would never be able to forget what I'd found there. "There's a situation," he'd said after ending the call, his voice back to business even though his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, even though I could see the tension in every line of his body. "Marco found evidence of a traitor in the organization, someone feeding information to the Calabrians, and I need to deal with it now before they can do more damage, but, Sophia, we're not finished here. Not by a long shot. And when I come back, we're going to talk about what the hell is happening between us, and what we're going to do about it." He'd left then, striding toward the elevator with Marco appearing from somewhere to join him, and I'd been alone in the penthouse with my racing thoughts, and the ghost of his kiss still burning on my lips, and the terrible knowledge that something had fundamentally changed tonight, that the carefully maintained professional distance had been shattered beyond repair, and that whatever happened next would either destroy us both or transform us into something neither of us could predict. Something dangerous and impossible and maybe, terrifyingly, something real. I'd walked to my room in a daze, my mind replaying every moment of the evening, every touch and every word, and especially that devastating kiss that had felt like a promise and a threat, and a beginning and an ending all wrapped into one perfect moment of surrender. And I'd known with absolute certainty that my 6 months working for Dante Marchetti were going to be far more complicated than I'd ever imagined, that falling for him was the most dangerous thing I'd ever done, and that I was doing it anyway, with my eyes wide open and my heart already too invested to protect, already belonging to a man who'd never promised me anything except protection, and who I was starting to suspect needed protecting from his own isolation, just as much as I needed protecting from the world that wanted me dead. I'd broken my own rule and fallen in love with Dante Marchetti. And love in the Mafia was the most dangerous weapon of all, the kind of vulnerability that got people killed or worse, that gave enemies leverage and created weaknesses where none should exist. And someone was about to use it to destroy us both in ways I couldn't have anticipated, even in my darkest nightmares, about what happened to women stupid enough to give their hearts to monsters who wore beautiful faces and spoke with voices that could convince you safety existed in their arms. The morning after that kiss, after Dante had left to handle his crisis, and I'd spent the night replaying every moment until exhaustion finally dragged me into fitful sleep, I'd woken to find him already gone again, a note on the kitchen counter in his precise handwriting saying only that he'd be back tonight and that we needed to talk. And the anticipation of that conversation had left me restless and anxious all day, pacing the penthouse like a caged animal, unable to work or focus or think about anything except the feel of his mouth on mine, and the way he'd looked at me like I was something precious and terrifying at the same time. But when Dante had finally returned that evening, he hadn't been alone, Marco trailing behind him, with an expression that suggested whatever they'd discovered about the traitor in their organization was worse than they'd initially thought. And I'd watched Dante move through the penthouse with a tension in his shoulders that spoke of violence barely contained, of rage held in check through sheer force of will. And I'd known immediately that our conversation would have to wait because something had shifted in the carefully balanced world he controlled with such ruthless precision. He'd called me into his office where Marco was already spreading documents and photographs across the massive desk, and the grim determination in both their faces had sent ice flooding through my veins because I'd seen that look before. on my father's face in those last weeks before he died. The expression of men who knew betrayal was coming, but didn't yet know from which direction the knife would strike. "We have a serious problem," Dante had said without preamble, his voice carrying none of the warmth or vulnerability I'd heard last night. All business now, all cold calculation and strategic thinking. And I'd forced myself to focus on his words instead of the way my body responded to his proximity. The way every cell in me wanted to close the distance between us and pick up where we'd left off, even though the timing was catastrophically wrong. Someone in my inner circle has been feeding information to the Calabrians for at least 3 months, maybe longer, which means they know details about our operations, our shipments, our financial arrangements, everything that matters, and they're planning something big, something that will either destroy my organization or cripple it so badly that the other families will move in like sharks scenting blood in the water. Marco had pushed several photographs toward me, surveillance images of men I vaguely recognized from my time in the penthouse, members of Dante's crew who came and went with the regularity of trusted employees, and I'd felt my stomach drop because I knew what was coming. Knew that Dante was about to ask me to use my skills at detecting deception and forgery to help identify which of these men had betrayed him, to become complicit in whatever justice or vengeance he would deliver once the traitor was exposed. "We need you to examine documents, communication records, anything these men have touched or signed or approved," Dante continued, his eyes never leaving my face, watching for my reaction with that intensity that made me feel transparent, like he could see every thought crossing my mind, every doubt and fear and conflicted feeling. "Your ability to spot inconsistencies and forgeries extends beyond art and contracts, Sophia. Your father taught you to see patterns that others miss, to recognize when something is wrong even if you can't immediately articulate why. And right now, I need those eyes on my people because traditional interrogation methods take time we don't have and make mistakes I can't afford." I'd wanted to refuse, wanted to tell him that hunting traitors wasn't part of our agreement, that my 6 months of service didn't include becoming his personal lie detector or participating in the kind of investigation that would inevitably end in someone's blood on his hands. But the desperate edge in his voice beneath the command, the way his jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping, the barely suppressed fear that someone he'd trusted had turned against him. All of it made the refusal die in my throat, because I'd finally understood what was at stake here. This wasn't just about money or territory or power. This was personal for Dante. A betrayal that cut deeper than business because in his world, loyalty was the only currency that truly mattered, the only thing that separated family from enemies, and discovering that someone close to him had sold him out was the kind of wound that didn't heal cleanly, no matter how much violence you used to cauterize it. So I'd spent the next week drowning in documents and recordings, examining everything with the meticulous attention my father had drilled into me, looking for the subtle tells that separated truth from deception, authentic from fabricated, loyalty from betrayal, and it had been exhausting work that left me blind and headache-ridden by the end of each day. Dante had worked alongside me, our earlier tension temporarily shelved under the weight of more immediate crisis, though I'd caught him watching me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, something hungry and possessive and maybe a little bit desperate, as if he was afraid I'd disappear if he looked away too long, as if the kiss we'd shared had fundamentally altered something in how he saw me and he didn't quite know what to do with that transformation. We'd fallen into a rhythm, working late into the night, ordering takeout that usually went cold while we pored over evidence, and there had been moments of accidental intimacy, his hand brushing mine as we reached for the same file, our shoulders touching when we leaned over the desk together, his breath warm on my neck when he read over my shoulder, and each touch had been electric, charged with the unfinished business between us, the conversation we still needed to have, the feelings that were growing despite every logical reason they shouldn't. Marco had become a constant presence, his protective instincts extending to me now in ways that suggested Dante had made his claim clear to his organization. that everyone knew I was more than just a temporary consultant, more than just an asset to be protected out of obligation. And I'd caught whispers among the men who came and went from the penthouse, speculation about who I was and what I meant to their boss, and whether I represented weakness or strength in his armor. I'd started to feel safe for the first time since fleeing Sicily, started to believe that maybe Dante's protection meant something real, that maybe I could have some semblance of a life here in his world, even though that life would always be colored by violence and criminality, and that growing sense of security had made me careless, had made me forget that safety in the Mafia was always an illusion that could shatter the moment someone decided you were more valuable as a target than as a person. It had been my idea to cross-reference the communication patterns with the timing of the Calabrian attacks, to look for correlations between information leaks and specific people's access to that information, and the pattern that emerged had been damning and impossible to ignore, pointing to someone I'd never have suspected, someone whose loyalty Dante had never questioned because it had been forged through years of shared violence and mutual dependence. Marco had gone pale when I'd shown him my findings, the careful documentation that proved beyond reasonable doubt that the traitor was someone in Dante's innermost circle, someone who'd been there from the beginning, someone whose betrayal would cut deeper than any knife. And I'd watched him struggle with whether to show Dante immediately or to investigate further, to be absolutely certain before destroying his boss's faith in someone he considered family. But the decision had been taken out of our hands when Dante had walked into the office and seen our faces, had read the truth in our expressions, with that uncanny ability he had to see through pretense, and he'd demanded to see what we'd found with a voice that promised violence to whoever had betrayed him, promised the kind of retribution that would be talked about in hushed whispers for years after. I'd handed him the file with trembling hands, watched his face go absolutely still as he processed the evidence, watched the color drain from his features, and then flood back as rage replaced shock, and the cold fury in his eyes when he'd finally looked up had been terrifying in its intensity, the kind of anger that burned at temperatures hot enough to melt steel or human resolve. "Marco," he'd said, and just that one word had carried enough weight to make his consigliere flinch, enough command to make it clear that whatever friendship existed between them was temporarily suspended under the weight of this betrayal. "Get out!" The evidence pointed to Marco himself, the patterns I'd uncovered showing that every leak, every piece of information that had reached the Calabrians had passed through his hands first. And the realization of what I'd just done, who I'd just exposed, had hit me like a physical blow because Marco had been kind to me, had protected me, had seemed genuinely invested in keeping me safe. And now I'd signed his death warrant with my father's skills and my own desperate need to help Dante, to prove my loyalty, to be valuable enough that he'd want to keep me beyond the 6 months we'd agreed to. But Marco hadn't moved toward the door. Instead, he'd pulled a gun from inside his jacket with practiced ease, and suddenly the weapon was pointed at me instead of at Dante. And I'd understood with crystalline clarity that I'd made a terrible mistake, that the evidence I'd uncovered was exactly what Marco had wanted me to find, that I'd been played by someone far more skilled at deception than I'd given him credit for. "I'm sorry it has to be this way," Marco had said, and he'd actually sounded regretful, like he genuinely wished there was another option, like having to kill me was an inconvenience he'd have preferred to avoid. "But you're too smart for your own good, Sophia, just like your father was too principled for his own survival, and I can't have you digging any deeper into the real evidence, can't risk you uncovering the truth about who's really been feeding information to the Calabrians and why, so you're going to have to be the sacrifice that saves my plan." Dante had gone completely still beside me, every muscle tensed and ready to spring. But Marco had anticipated that too, had positioned himself perfectly so that any move Dante made would result in a bullet in my chest before he could reach his own weapon. And I'd seen the calculation flash across Dante's face, seen him weighing odds and possibilities and coming up empty, coming to the same terrible conclusion I'd already reached, which was that Marco held all the cards right now, and we were at his mercy for however long he chose to extend it. "You framed yourself," Dante said slowly, his voice deadly quiet. The kind of calm that preceded hurricanes. You created evidence pointing to yourself as the traitor, knowing that Sophia would find it, knowing that when we confronted you, it would give you the perfect opportunity to eliminate the one person who could actually uncover the real conspiracy. And then what? You were going to kill me too. Make it look like you died heroically protecting me from Sophia, who turned out to be the Calabrian plant all along? Marco's smile had been almost apologetic, acknowledging Dante's intelligence even as he betrayed him. And I'd felt sick watching the pieces fall into place, understanding how thoroughly I'd been manipulated, how my skills had been used against me to walk straight into a trap that would end with my death, and Dante's organization in ruins. The evidence against Sophia is already planted in her room, Marco had said conversationally, like he was discussing the weather instead of orchestrating a murder. Documents showing she's been selling your secrets since the day she arrived, communication records with Calabrian contacts, payment receipts, everything anyone would need to believe she played you from the beginning, that her supposed loyalty was just a long con to get close enough to destroy you from the inside. The betrayal in those words hurt worse than the gun pointed at my chest. The knowledge that Marco had been planning this for weeks, that every kindness he'd shown me had been calculated to make this moment more devastating, that while I'd been falling for Dante and believing I'd found something like family in this violent world, someone had been laying the groundwork to destroy us both using my own skills as the weapon. Dante won't believe it, I'd said, my voice steady despite the terror flooding my system, despite the certainty that I was about to die in this beautiful office overlooking the city I'd tried to make home. He knows me, knows I would never betray him, and no amount of planted evidence will convince him otherwise. But Marco's expression had shifted into something pitying, something that suggested he knew things I didn't, understood dynamics I'd missed, and his next words had shattered whatever fragile hope I'd been clinging to like glass under a hammer. "Won't he, though?" Marco had asked, and the doubt he planted with those two words was more devastating than any physical blow could have been. Dante Marchetti has survived this long by trusting no one completely, by always expecting betrayal from the people closest to him, and you're a woman he's known for less than a month, who has every reason to want revenge against the world that killed her father, who has the skills to deceive him in ways no one else could, who showed up at exactly the right moment to save him from one scam, which could so easily have been engineered to make him trust her enough to let down his guard for the next one. I'd turned to look at Dante then, desperate to see contradiction in his face, desperate to find certainty that he believed in me despite the logic of Marco's words. But what I'd seen had broken something fundamental inside me because his expression had gone carefully blank, closed off in the way it had been that first night in the restaurant, and I'd realized with horror that Marco had found the exact crack in Dante's armor, the one vulnerability that all his power and intelligence couldn't protect him from, which was the bone-deep certainty that eventually everyone he trusted would betray him, because that was what his experience had taught him, what his father's paranoia had drilled into him, what surviving in his world required him to believe. "Dante," I'd whispered, hearing the desperation in my own voice and hating it, hating that I was begging for his trust when I should have simply had it, when everything I'd done over the past weeks should have proven my loyalty beyond any doubt. You know me. You know I would never hurt you, never betray you, and you have to trust that. Have to believe in what's between us more than you believe in whatever evidence Marco has manufactured. The silence that followed had been suffocating, stretching into eternity while Dante looked at me with those ice-blue eyes that had warmed for me in private moments, but now seemed cold as death, weighing evidence and probability, and years of learned mistrust against a few weeks of proximity, and one kiss that had felt like everything but might have meant nothing. And I'd watched him struggle with the decision that would determine whether I lived or died, whether love was possible for men like him, or whether he was too damaged by his world to ever truly trust another person. Marco had used those moments to move toward the door, backing away while keeping the gun trained on me. And I'd understood that he was going to leave us here with the planted evidence and the seeds of doubt he'd sown, Going to let Dante's own paranoia and mistrust do the work of destroying us more thoroughly than any bullet could. "You have a choice, boss," Marco had said from the doorway, his voice carrying false sympathy that made me want to scream. "Believe the evidence and do what needs to be done to protect yourself and your organization, or believe her and become the kind of fool who gets destroyed by a pretty face and a sad story. But either way, I'll be downstairs waiting to clean up whatever mess you make because, unlike everyone else in your life, I've never betrayed you, and I never will. Which is more than you can say about the daughter of a forger who's made a career out of lying for money." Then he was gone, leaving us alone in the terrible silence he'd created, and I'd stood there frozen while Dante walked slowly to the desk, where Marco had left several files, the supposed evidence of my betrayal, and I'd watched him open them with mechanical precision, his face giving nothing away as he reviewed documents I'd never seen, communications I'd never sent, proof of treachery I'd never committed, but that looked absolutely damning when assembled with professional skill. The seconds ticked past like years while he read, while he processed, while he made the calculation that would seal my fate, and I'd felt my heart breaking with each passing moment because I'd been stupid enough to fall in love with a man who'd been taught that love was weakness, that trust was suicide, that everyone eventually betrayed you if you gave them the chance and the motivation. When he finally looked up from the files, his expression was cold, in a way I'd never seen directed at me before. All the warmth and vulnerability and growing affection wiped away like it had never existed, replaced by the mask of the ruthless boss who'd built an empire on the corpses of people who'd underestimated him, or crossed him, or simply been in his way at the wrong moment. He opened a desk drawer with deliberate slowness and pulled out a gun, the same Beretta he'd pressed to the Calabrian's forehead that first night, and my breath caught in my throat as he checked the magazine with practiced ease, as he stood and walked toward me with the weapon held loosely at his side, as I understood that despite everything we'd shared, despite the kiss and the growing intimacy and the way he'd looked at me like I mattered, he was actually going to do this, actually going to choose paranoid self-preservation over the fragile trust we'd been building. "Dante, please," I'd heard myself say, and I'd hated the pleading in my voice but couldn't stop it. Couldn't stop the tears that were sliding down my cheeks, or the trembling in my hands, or the desperate need to make him see the truth before it was too late, before he made a choice he couldn't unmake. "You know this is wrong. You know I'm not capable of this kind of betrayal. And if you kill me, you'll be alone forever, surrounded by people who fear you, or use you, or lie to you. But never anyone who actually sees you the way I do, who knows the man beneath the monster and chooses him anyway." He'd raised the gun slowly, pointing it at my heart with the same steady hand that had touched me so carefully last night, and I'd forced myself to look him in the eyes instead of at the weapon that was about to end my life. Forced myself to let him see everything I felt, even if it wasn't enough to save me. And I'd watch something flicker across his features, some crack in the cold mask, some echo of the vulnerability he'd shown me when we were alone. "If you kill me, cara mio," I'd said in Sicilian, using the endearment deliberately, making it both a reminder and a challenge, "you'll be alone forever, and you'll know you killed the only person who truly saw you, who loved you despite understanding exactly what you are, and that knowledge will haunt you for whatever years you have left before this life catches up with you and someone does to you what you're about to do to me." His finger had tightened on the trigger, and I'd closed my eyes because I couldn't watch him do it. Couldn't bear to see the moment when whatever we'd been building died along with me. And I'd thought of my father and my mother and the life I'd tried so hard to build from the ashes of my past. And I'd thought it was fitting in a terrible way that I'd die at the hands of a man I loved in a penthouse, overlooking a city that had never really been mine, killed by the same paranoid mistrust that had killed my father, the same inability to believe that loyalty could exist without ulterior motives, and I'd waited for the explosion and the pain and the darkness that would follow. But the shot didn't come, and when I'd finally opened my eyes after what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, Dante had lowered the gun slightly, his hand shaking in a way I'd never seen before, and his face had transformed into something between agony and rage and desperate confusion. And I'd understood that Marco's plan had a fatal flaw, which was that Dante Marchetti had fallen for me too, had let me past his defenses despite every instinct screaming at him not to. And now he was trapped between the evidence his mind said he should trust and the connection his heart insisted was real. "Give me 5 minutes," he'd said finally, his voice rough and breaking. 5 minutes to prove your innocence, or I swear to God, Sophia, I will pull this trigger because I can't afford to be wrong about you. Can't afford to let sentiment cloud my judgment when my entire organization is at stake. So tell me how to prove Marco is lying before I lose whatever humanity is left in me and do what logic says I should have done the moment he walked out that door. Dante Marchetti had never hesitated to pull a trigger until the moment he looked into Sophia Romano's eyes and saw his own soul reflected back at him. And that hesitation had saved both our lives, had given me the precious gift of 5 minutes to prove my innocence when most people in my position would have been dead before they hit the floor. And I'd used those minutes like a woman possessed. My father's training taking over as I walked Dante through the planted evidence with shaking hands and a voice that somehow stayed steady, despite the gun still pointed at my heart. I'd shown him the subtle inconsistencies in the forged documents, the way Marco had tried to replicate my handwriting, but had gotten the pressure points wrong, because he didn't understand that my father had taught me to write with specific rhythm and flow that was as unique as a fingerprint. The way the dates on the supposed communications didn't align with times I could prove I'd been elsewhere, working beside Dante himself in this very office. But the real proof had been hidden in the one place Marco would never have thought to look, in an authentication I'd done 3 weeks ago on a supposedly legitimate shipping contract that Marco himself had brought to me for verification. And I'd pulled the original from Dante's files with trembling fingers, laid it beside one of the documents from Marco's planted evidence, and watched Dante's expression shift from cold calculation to dawning horror as he saw what I was showing him. He copied my authentication style, I'd explained, my words tumbling out in a rush now that I could see belief starting to replace doubt in Dante's eyes. Used the same phrasing and structure I'd used on legitimate documents, but he made one critical mistake, which is that every authentication I do includes a subtle pattern in how I describe the brushwork or ink composition, a coded sequence my father taught me to embed in my analysis reports so I could always prove my work was genuine, and Marco's forgeries have that pattern. But he applied it wrong because he didn't know it was code. Dante had lowered the gun completely then, his hand dropping to his side like the weapon suddenly weighed too much to hold, and I'd watched the terrible realization wash over him, the understanding that he'd come within seconds of killing an innocent woman, of murdering someone who'd done nothing but try to help him, someone who'd protected him and worked for him and fallen in love with him despite every reason not to. He played us both, Dante had said, his voice hollow, and I'd watched him piece together the rest of Marco's plan with that brilliant strategic mind. Framed you knowing I'd be paranoid enough to believe the evidence, and while I was busy dealing with you, he'd be downstairs consolidating power, and probably already moving forward with whatever arrangement he has with the Calabrians. He'd pulled out his phone with mechanical precision, made 3 calls in rapid succession to people whose names I didn't recognize, clipped acknowledgements that suggested they were mobilizing forces and locking down locations, and I'd understood that whatever happened next would be brutal and final, and probably involve more violence than I wanted to witness but couldn't look away from, because this was my world now. This was what loving Dante Marchetti meant. "Stay here," he'd commanded, already moving toward the door, but I'd grabbed his arm before he could leave because I couldn't let him walk into danger without saying what needed to be said. "I love you," I'd said, the words stark and simple and terrifying in their honesty. "I love you even though it's insane and dangerous and probably the stupidest thing I've ever admitted. And I need you to know that before you go downstairs, need you to understand that choosing to believe me just now, giving me those 5 minutes instead of just pulling the trigger, that was the most important decision you've ever made because it means you're capable of trust even after everything that's tried to teach you not to be." He'd pulled me into a kiss that was desperate and claiming and tinged with the knowledge of how close we'd both come to losing everything. And when we broke apart, he said against my lips, "I love you too. And I'm sorry I doubted you. Sorry I let old wounds almost destroy the best thing that's happened to me in years." We'd argued briefly about me staying behind, but ultimately he'd agreed I could come because I was the only person he could trust absolutely now that Marco had revealed himself, and we'd gone down together to face whatever waited below. The confrontation with Marco had been everything I'd expected, and worse. Dante striding into his own operations center where Marco was already coordinating with several key lieutenants, and the moment Marco had seen us together, had seen that I was still alive and that Dante's expression promised death. He'd known his plan had failed and had made the split-second decision to go down fighting. The firefight that followed had been chaos and terror, and I'd pressed myself against a pillar with Dante's spare gun, clutched in shaking hands, while he moved through the space with brutal efficiency, taking down Marco's people while shouting orders to the men loyal to him. I'd seen Marco trying to position himself for a shot at Dante's back, and my body had moved before my mind could process the decision, stepping out from cover and firing the gun, the bullet catching Marco in the shoulder and spinning him around, saving Dante's life but also destroying whatever was left of my innocence, making me complicit in the violence in ways I could never take back. Dante had finished it quickly after that, putting Marco down with professional detachment. And then it was over. The sudden silence after the gunfire almost as shocking as the noise had been. And I'd been standing there trying to process what I'd just done and what it meant for who I was becoming. Dante had crossed to me immediately, checking me for injuries with desperate thoroughness. And when he'd confirmed I was physically unharmed, he'd pulled me into his arms, and I'd let myself collapse against him, let the adrenaline drain away and be replaced by shaking and tears, and the delayed shock of having almost died and having killed to survive. 3 days later, after the chaos had settled and the immediate threats had been neutralized, Dante and I finally had the conversation we'd been putting off, sitting on his balcony overlooking the city at sunset. The sky painted in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost obscenely beautiful, given everything we'd been through. "I'm not letting you go," Dante had said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "Not after 6 months or 6 years or ever, and I know that's not what we agreed to. But you've shown me that maybe there's space in this life for something real, if you're brave enough to reach for it." "I'm not going anywhere," I'd answered, feeling the truth of it settle into my bones. "I choose this, choose you, choose the dangerous, complicated, impossible life we're going to build together. But I need you to understand that I'm your partner in every way that matters, which means you don't get to protect me from the realities of your world anymore, or make decisions about my safety without consulting me." He'd pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a ring that was simple and elegant, and said, "Then let me make you a different offer than the one I made that first night. Not 6 months of employment, but a lifetime of partnership. And I'm asking you to wear this as a promise that when you're ready, I'll ask properly, and hope you say yes." I'd taken the ring and slid it onto my finger where it caught the dying light and seemed to glow like captured fire, and said, "Ask me again in 6 months, when we've had time to be normal together, whatever normal means for people like us, and I'll give you an answer that doesn't come with any hesitation at all." 6 months later, Dante asked again, this time with my mother's ring that he'd somehow tracked down and purchased, giving me back a piece of my past while promising me a future. And I'd said yes without any doubts, because by then I'd learned that Dante Marchetti was more than just a boss or a criminal. He was a man who kept his word and protected what was his, and loved with the same intensity he brought to everything else in his life. Now, standing in the same penthouse where I'd almost died, and had instead found love, looking out at the city that had become mine through choice, I thought about how the scared girl who'd fled Sicily had transformed into a woman who ruled beside the most powerful man in New York, who used her father's cursed gift to protect rather than exploit, who'd found family in the last place she'd ever expected to look. Dante came up behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist as we looked out at the glittering city together. And I leaned back into his embrace, into the certainty of his presence and his love. "What are you thinking about, cara mia?" he murmured, and I turned in his arms so I could see his face. "I'm thinking that I saved you from a $150 million scam," I answered. "But you saved me from a life half-lived, from spending forever hiding what I was and running from what I could become, and together we built something that shouldn't exist but does, something beautiful and terrible and strong enough to weather anything, and I wouldn't change a single moment of how we got here because all of it led to this. To us. To finding home in the most unlikely place and the most impossible person." He kissed me then, soft and deep and full of promise, and when we broke apart, he was smiling. "You talk too much, Sophia Marchetti," he said, and I laughed because it was true. But I wouldn't change a single word, wouldn't change anything about you or us or how we got here. And standing there in our penthouse kingdom, wrapped in the arms of a man who'd been a monster until I'd shown him he could be more, I understood that love in the Mafia was the most dangerous weapon of all, but it was also the most powerful armor, the thing that transformed survivors into something greater. And that home wasn't where you came from, but who you chose to build a life with, even when that life was painted in shades of darkness and light, and all the complicated colors in between.